Damien Steele, at 36, sat in his expansive corner office, surveying the city he ruled through steel and capital. Over the years, he'd bulldozed rivals and acquired companies, forging Steele Enterprises into a global giant. Cold, efficient, and dismissive of personal attachments, he believed love was merely a liability. Family, to him, was an unnecessary distraction from the pursuit of power. His razor-sharp focus made him legendary and feared. Behind his success, though, lay a past marked by loneliness. Orphaned at a young age, Damien had learned survival by building walls around his heart. The result? Wealth, respect, and an impenetrable fortress of independence. Late in the afternoon, Damien concluded yet another merger meeting. Reports piled on his desk, each a testament to his ruthless ambition. His assistant, a young man who'd never dared to pry into Damien's personal life, asked meekly if he ever considered slowing down. Damien scoffed, eyes as cold as steel. "Slowing down is for the weak," he said. "And showing weakness in business is like bleeding in a shark tank." He brushed off any further attempts at small talk. The truth was, he'd long ago decided that attachments were a soft spot adversaries could exploit. Yet, for all his certainty, life had a different plan. For children, his spitting image, were about to challenge the principles he'd lived by. And in doing so, they would shatter every assumption he had about family, love, and vulnerability. It was a rare excursion that forced Damien back to the neglected neighborhood where he'd grown up. A property sale required his physical signature, and so he drove himself, annoyed at the detour. The streets bore the weight of hard years, chipped paint on aging buildings, trash-strewn alleys, and a sense of quiet desperation. Parking his sleek luxury car outside a dingy convenience store, he glanced around, remembering a boyhood he preferred to forget. Suddenly, boisterous laughter caught his attention. For children played an improvised game of tag on the curb. They couldn't have been older than 5 or 6, maybe 7, their youthful shouts echoing against grimy walls. He intended to walk on by, until his gaze locked on the face of one boy. The child had the same stormy gray eyes Damien saw in the mirror every morning. Confusion knifed through him as he noticed each of the 4 kids bore a striking resemblance to him, the same sharp features, the same dark hair. It was impossible to ignore. Before Damien could approach, a woman rushed from the store, her expression fraught with panic. "Axel, Lucas, Ivy, Arya, come here, now." Her tone was urgent. She looked up at Damien, and for an instant, the shock in her eyes matched his own. Swiftly, she herded the children inside, casting terrified glances over her shoulder. Damien stood rooted to the spot, heart pounding. The familiarity in their faces was uncanny. Was it a trick? A bizarre coincidence? He tried to follow, but by the time he reached the doorway, they had disappeared down a narrow corridor. The store clerk merely shrugged when asked who the woman was. Returning to his car, Damien felt something he hadn't felt in years, a tremor of uncertainty, an unsettling sense that his tightly controlled life was about to be undone by 4 pairs of innocent eyes. Damien's routine shattered. Back at his penthouse, a sleek testament to his success, perched high above the city, he couldn't concentrate on the financial statements in front of him. The children's faces haunted him, the boy's direct gaze, the girl's shy smile, the similarity in their features. And the woman who whisked them away, her fear palpable. "Sir, are you all right?" his assistant ventured, noticing Damien hadn't moved from his chair for nearly half an hour. Damien didn't respond immediately. His mind reeled. If those children were his, how could he not know? He'd always been careful, discreet encounters, ironclad confidentiality. No woman he'd met had ever hinted at pregnancy. Yet, doubt nibbled at his composure. He picked up his phone. "Logan," he said, addressing his real estate liaison, "forget the property paperwork for a moment. Find out who lives near the convenience store on 5th and Pine. Specifically, a woman with 4 kids, twins, maybe quadruplets." He paused, inhaling slowly. "I need a name." By midnight, he had it. Elena Rivers, a single mother who had moved into that rundown neighborhood 6 years prior. Minimal records existed, no marriage certificate, no known relatives in the area. The information only deepened the mystery. Why had she hidden? Why did she panic at seeing him? Sleep eluded Damien. The empire he'd spent years perfecting suddenly felt hollow, overshadowed by a question he was desperate to answer. Who exactly was Elena Rivers, and what was her connection to him? The days that followed tested Damien's self-control. Instead of burying himself in corporate expansions, he found excuses to drive through that old neighborhood, his eyes scanning for any glimpse of those children. Each time, the memory of their identical features unsettled him, stirring something that felt suspiciously like protectiveness. After his usual sources turned up little, he hired Detective Morgan Cruz, a private investigator known for meticulous work and absolute discretion. Meeting Cruz in a private suite at a 5-star hotel, Damien laid out the facts as succinctly as possible. "I want to know who Elena Rivers is," he said. "Everything, her finances, her background, and especially any reason 4 kids might look like me." Cruz raised an eyebrow, unaccustomed to seeing Damien unsettled. "I'll do my best, Mr. Steele. But if these kids are related to you..." Damien cut him off. "Prove it first. Then we'll decide the next steps." Cruz nodded, noting the severity in Damien's tone. Quietly, he asked, "Sir, if they are yours, do you intend to bring them into your life?" Damien hesitated, an uncharacteristic pause. Finally, he answered, "That depends on why they were hidden in the first place." As Cruz departed, Damien found his composure returning. He was a man of action. Once he had data, he would confront Elena Rivers himself. Until then, the uncertainty gnawed at him, a reminder that even a billionaire's life could tilt off axis with one unexpected discovery. Detective Cruz wasted no time. Over a week, he pulled public records, interviewed neighbors, and discreetly obtained DNA from a plastic cup left behind at a local diner Elena frequented. Meanwhile, Damien's obsession deepened. The usual parade of board meetings and investor calls irritated him. He was curt and distant, leaving staff unsettled. Late one evening, his phone buzzed. Cruz spoke in hushed tones, mindful of confidentiality. "Elena Rivers has no visible family ties. She moved here 6 years ago, gave birth to quadruplets, though there's no hospital record under her name. She's been working 2 jobs to support them. Also, I uncovered something interesting. She received periodic wire transfers from an offshore account for 4 years, and then they stopped." Damien's grip on the phone tightened. So she was hiding? Or someone paid her to keep quiet? "Possibly both," Cruz replied. "The question is why." Damien stared out his penthouse window, the city a glittering sprawl beneath him. "And the DNA test? It'll be ready tomorrow. I'll send the results directly to you." Ending the call, Damien felt a surge of adrenaline and dread. For the first time, power eluded him. The truth about these children might be the one thing beyond his calculated control. That night, he tossed and turned, visions of 4 small faces dancing through the corridors of his mind. The next day, Detective Cruz arrived at Damien's office, carrying a sealed envelope. Damien dismissed his staff, ensuring total privacy. Cruz set the envelope on Damien's polished desk. He cleared his throat. "I think you already suspect what these results say." Damien's heart hammered. He tore open the envelope and skimmed the lab report. 4 sets of DNA, each with a 99.99% match to his own. A paternal match. He stared, the weight of this knowledge pressing down on him. He had children, quadruplets, and he'd had no idea. The silence stretched. Cruz spoke gently. "What do you want me to do now, Mr. Steele?" Damien inhaled sharply. "That's all, Detective." "Thank you." When Cruz left, Damien leaned back in his chair, reading the report again, as if repetition could make it less shocking. His mind churned with questions, regrets, and a peculiar sense of awe. For a man who had insulated himself from any emotional entanglement, fatherhood was the last thing he'd expected. And yet, here it was, an undeniable truth. Rising, he paced the room, grappling with anger that Elena had hidden them, concern for the children's well-being, and an odd spark of longing. He'd missed 6 years of their lives. No matter why Elena had kept them secret, he intended to find answers and claim his right to be their father. Damien wasted no time. Early the next afternoon, he strode into a worn-down diner where Elena reportedly worked the late shift. The neon sign outside flickered ominously as he entered, scanning the cramped booths. He spotted her behind the counter, wearing a faded apron. She looked up, and fear flickered across her face. Murmurs rippled through the diner as patrons recognized the billionaire's imposing figure. "Elena," Damien said, voice low. "We need to talk." Her hand shook as she put down a coffee pot. "Damien, you shouldn't be here." His eyes hardened. "I found out about the children." She froze, color draining from her cheeks. A moment passed before she glanced around, eyes pleading. "Not here. Let me finish my shift." Damien, arms folded, slid into a corner booth. The tension was tangible as the diner's patrons cast sidelong glances. Elena returned to serving orders, though her hands trembled the entire time. 20 minutes later, she removed her apron and motioned for him to follow her outside. In the parking lot, under a buzzing street lamp, she faced him, shoulders hunched in silent dread. Damien cut straight to the point. "They're mine. Why did you hide them?" Elena's voice cracked. "Because you, and they could have been killed if I didn't." His brow furrowed. "Killed by whom?" She shook her head, eyes haunted. "I can't do this here. Please, let me explain somewhere safe." His anger flared. "You had 6 years to tell me I was a father." Tears welled in her eyes. "I did what I had to. Tomorrow night, meet me at the abandoned park on Riverton Road. Come alone. I'll tell you everything." Against his instincts, Damien relented. He watched her climb into an old sedan and drive off. The raw desperation in her eyes stoked his determination. Whatever Elena's secret was, it involved dangerous threats, and it had kept him from his own children. The next night, the abandoned park on Riverton Road lay cloaked in shadows. Tall trees swayed in the breeze, their branches creaking like old bones. Damien arrived alone, leaving even his personal security behind at Elena's request. He found her near a graffiti-smeared bench. She looked smaller than he remembered, dwarfed by tension. Silence loomed until she finally spoke, voice trembling. 6 years ago, she began, I discovered I was pregnant. Before I could tell you, Victor Langley's men approached me. They said if I ever revealed the pregnancy to you, or if I stayed in your life, they'd kill us both. Damien's jaw tightened. Victor Langley, his most ruthless business rival, known for shady dealings and a thirst to topple steel enterprises. But to threaten murder? Elena continued, swallowing hard. They forced me to disappear. I got hush money from an offshore account, but it ended 2 years ago. I've been struggling since. All I knew was that if you found out about the kids, Langley would use them as leverage or worse. Damien's fury mounted. The corporate battles he'd waged with Langley seemed trivial in comparison to this. You should have come to me, he said, anger and regret shading his tone. I would have protected you. She stared at the ground. You don't know Langley's reach. He has contacts everywhere. You might be powerful, but he's cunning. I was terrified. A heavy pause stretched. Damien's voice softened. We can't live in fear of him. Those children are mine, and I refuse to let him dictate their lives. Or yours. Elena hugged herself against the biting wind. Then be prepared, Damien, because Langley won't rest until he destroys you, and anyone close to you. Fury festered in Damien's veins. Returning to his penthouse, he reviewed every corner of his war with Langley. They'd clashed over corporate takeovers, patents, and land deals. Damien assumed it was standard business rivalry, ruthless, but not murderous. Now, he realized how deeply Langley was willing to cut. He phoned Detective Cruz. Dig into every connection Langley has. Offshore accounts, hidden assets, anything that ties to hush money for Elena Rivers. Cruz, already suspecting Langley's involvement, promised to deliver. Meanwhile, Damien visited Elena's cramped apartment for the first time under the guise of anonymity. He saw the 4 children up close. They stared at him, half curious, half uneasy. Axel, the oldest by minutes, approached. "Are you really our dad?" The boy's voice quavered with caution. Damien crouched, meeting the child's gaze. "Yes," he managed. "I am." The other three hovered behind their mother. Ivy, the sole girl, clutched Elena's hand. "Why didn't you come before?" she asked, innocence piercing Damien's heart. Elena braced herself, waiting for his answer. Damien exhaled. "I didn't know. But I'm here now. I want to make sure you're safe." The kids exchanged glances, a glimmer of trust mingled with apprehension. Elena watched from the side, torn between relief that Damien cared and fear that Langley would retaliate. No matter what, she thought, their fragile equilibrium was about to be tested by a man who thrived on others' vulnerabilities. Damien vowed not to let Langley's threats stand. Gathering his top advisors at Steel Enterprises, he initiated an all-out offensive. "We don't wait for his next move," he said, voice resonating with cool anger. "We target his partnerships, scrutinize his finances, expose any corruption we find." His team looked uneasy. One executive, a middle-aged woman named Karen Long, spoke up. "Sir, open war might destabilize your own holdings. We need caution." "Caution won't protect my children," he cut in. His eyes were steely, brooking no argument. Langley's crossed a line. "I'll tear down every pillar of his empire if that's what it takes." Though stunned, the board complied. Within days, Steel Enterprises quietly maneuvered to threaten Langley's supply chains and undercut his biggest contracts. Rumors of sabotage circulated in high-level circles. Despite the apparent progress, Damien felt an undercurrent of dread, knowing Langley would retaliate in kind. Meanwhile, detective crews uncovered enough evidence to confirm Langley's secret payments to Elena. When Damien confronted Elena with the documentation, she nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "This is what I was paid to disappear," she whispered. Then it stopped, and I had nowhere else to go. Damien's fury smoldered. "He paid you to keep me in the dark. Now he'll regret it." Yet as he steeled himself for battle, he sensed that his rival's capacity for cruelty ran deeper than corporate sabotage. Damien held his children close, figuratively for now, determined to shield them from a man who had woven their lives into a labyrinth of fear. Langley wasn't idle. Almost overnight, a series of damning articles appeared online, accusing Steel Enterprises of fraud, tax evasion, and unethical business practices. Anonymous sources claimed Damien had manipulated markets to crush smaller companies. The media frenzy rattled stockholders, causing Steel Enterprises' share price to dip. In a terse email to his executive suite, Langley gloated, referencing the downfall of an overextended empire. The message was as clear as it was spiteful. If Damien wanted to escalate, Langley would destroy him publicly. Elena called Damien late one evening, voice quaking. "I think someone followed me home." The kids said they saw a black SUV parked outside for hours. Damien's heart lurched, overshadowing any corporate concerns. "Pack your things," he commanded. "You and the kids are moving into a secure property I own. My guards will protect you." She hesitated, fear of betrayal lingering. But after glancing at her children, who stared with wide, anxious eyes, she capitulated. "All right," she whispered. "We'll go." Damien arranged everything in a rush. He knew the legal complexities that might follow, yet none of that mattered now. Protecting his children took priority over any business. As he mobilized security teams, he realized how fatherhood had already reshaped him. Where once he'd focus on cunning strategies, he now felt a raw, near-panicked urgency for their safety. Elena and the quadruplets settled into a remote estate Damien owned under a shell corporation. Security cameras and a rotating team of guards ensured their isolation. The children, initially apprehensive, warmed to the space, a sprawling house with a large backyard. Damien visited daily. He brought puzzles, storybooks, and even the occasional stuffed animal, unsure how else to break the ice. The kids were curious. Lucas once asked, "Are you really as rich as everyone says?" Damien laughed softly, a sound foreign to him. "I have a lot of money, yes. But I trade a lot of it to keep you all safe." The boy blinked in confusion. Why? Damien's chest tightened with feelings he'd long suppressed. Because you matter more than business. Family is more important. He glanced at Elena, who studied him from the doorway, wrestling with her own mix of relief and lingering fear. But the respite was fleeting. News broke that Langley had filed a petition in court, declaring Damien an unfit father. He aimed to wrest custody, twisting the narrative to claim that Damien's cutthroat reputation and criminal dealings endangered the children. Enraged, Damien confided in Elena. He can't do this, he hissed, pacing the estate's living room. He's the criminal, not me. Elena sighed, anxiety etched on her face. He'll spin any lie to gain power. Though outraged, Damien resolved to fight back in court, determined to prove he could be a father to these children, even if he was still figuring out how to be one. As the custody battle loomed, Langley launched another bombshell. Tabloids lit up with shocking headlines: Elena Rivers, criminal past and fraudulent identity. They cited fabricated police reports, suggesting Elena was a con artist who had used stolen identities, swindling gullible men, including Damien Steele. Elena's eyes flooded with tears as she read the allegations. "This is all twisted," she said, voice shaking, holding up an inflammatory article. "They've taken the fact I used false names to hide from Langley and turned it into a criminal ring." Damien's anger grew. "He's doing this to undermine your credibility, painting you as an accomplice rather than a victim." Social media blazed with speculation. Damien faced queries from board members concerned about public image, but he refused to drop his support for Elena. "I've faced bigger storms," he snapped at them. "We stand by the truth." He rallied his legal team, collecting evidence of Elena's forced seclusion. The hush money records, the threats, all of it would be showcased in court. Yet, even as they prepared for legal warfare, a sense of dread lingered. Langley would not stop until he ripped Damien's personal life, and by extension, his children, apart. The crisis took a deeper turn when Damien discovered an inside mole. A panicked phone call from one of his senior staff revealed that board member Charles Davenport had been feeding sensitive intel to Langley. Davenport's motive? A mountain of gambling debt that Langley agreed to clear. Damien confronted Davenport in a private conference room. "You betrayed me," he said, voice thick with anger. "You endangered my children, my company." Davenport, perspiring heavily, stammered, "I had no choice, Damien. Langley threatened my wife's life if I didn't comply. I was desperate." Damien's hands balled into fists. "Get out," he hissed. "And expect legal action for corporate espionage." The revelation shook him. If Langley had infiltrated Steele Enterprises so thoroughly, what else was he capable of? Despite his vow to protect Elena and the children, Damien felt the weight of an oncoming collapse. Betrayal from within only strengthened his resolve to crush Langley once and for all, though he suspected the price would be high. At last, the custody hearings began. Media swarmed the courthouse steps, a circus of flashing cameras. Inside, tension crackled. Langley's team portrayed Damien as a ruthless predator, claiming his involvement with illegal operations endangered the children. They pointed to Elena's fabricated criminal history, insisting the children needed rescuing. Damien's lead attorney, Sharon Pike, countered with documented evidence of Langley's hush money, demonstrating his intimidation tactics. Elena took the stand, voice trembling as she described how Langley threatened her life. The judge listened, face inscrutable. When Damien was called, he addressed the court with an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I never knew these children existed until recently. Had I known, I would have done everything in my power to protect them. They are my family, and I will not allow a dangerous man to seize control of their lives." Outside the courtroom, reporters shouted questions. Damien shielded Elena, guiding her through the throng. The judge postponed a final ruling, requesting additional evidence and time to consider the complexities. Damien privately seethed, certain Langley would try another tactic to tip the scales, one that might put the children directly in harm's way. His worst fears were confirmed. Late one night, sirens wailed at the estate. Guards were found unconscious, dosed with a powerful sedative. Security cameras had been disabled by a professional. Most horrifying of all, the children were gone. Elena stood in the living room, tears streaming as Damien burst through the door. "Damien," she screamed. "They took them. Axel, Lucas, Ivy, Arya, they just disappeared." Shock and terror clashed in Damien's mind. He dialed Detective Cruz, who arrived moments later with local police. The scene was grim, signs of forced entry, a meticulously executed operation. Everyone knew who was behind it. Langley had seized the children, gambling that Damien's paternal desperation would force him to surrender. Heart pounding, Damien whispered, "I'll do anything. Anything to get them back." Elena clung to his arm. "What if he hurts them?" she asked, voice fractured by grief. Damien's rage flared. "He won't. He wants them as leverage." He gathered himself, knuckles white. But he's just declared war on the wrong man. While the police began searching for clues, Damien launched every resource at his disposal: private investigators, cyber experts, entire networks he'd built over decades. Yet nothing could quell the gnawing fear that he might be too late. Desperation overshadowed Damien's once impenetrable confidence. For days, he slept little, coordinating round-the-clock efforts with Detective Cruz. Elena, inconsolable, feared the worst. Their world narrowed to one goal: finding the children. Then, a cryptic note arrived by courier at Steel Enterprises: "Surrender your entire empire, or your children vanish forever." No signature, but the message was clear. Damien's throat tightened. He recalled a conversation with Elena when she first revealed Langley's threats. Now it had come to a vicious crescendo. Standing in his office, Damien stared at the skyline. This was everything he'd worked for: billions in assets, a global footprint. And for what? If he couldn't save his own children, none of it mattered. Elena appeared in the doorway, eyes rimmed with red. "He wants your company, doesn't he?" Damien nodded, voice hoarse. "He can have it. I'm done letting him hold our kids hostage." Shock flickered in her gaze. "But your life's work." He moved closer, taking her hand. "They're my life now." That night, he announced his decision to key shareholders. He would relinquish controlling interest in Steel Enterprises if that was the price for his children's safety. Some tried to dissuade him, but the father in him had already made the choice. Love, he realized, was not a weakness. It was the reason he couldn't give up, even if it meant forfeiting all he'd built. Damien arranged a secret meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts. He arrived alone at dusk, carrying legal documents that would hand over the bulk of Steel Enterprises to a holding company Langley controlled. The interior was dimly lit, each echo of his footsteps magnifying his dread. Langley stood in the center, flanked by armed men. He exuded triumph. "Always knew you'd crumble eventually," he said, voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "That empire was a monument to your arrogance. Now it's mine." Damien bit back his hatred. "Where are my children?" With a flick of Langley's hand, a side door opened. Axel and Ivy stepped out, eyes wide with terror, each guarded by a looming henchman. "The others?" Damien demanded, voice taut. Nearby, Langley drawled, "Sign the papers, and you'll see them." Damien moved to a makeshift table, pen in hand. Heart pounding, he reminded himself of a plan in motion. Even as he prepared to sign, Detective Cruz led a SWAT team surging from hidden vantage points. Sirens blared. Gunshots rang out in the dank air. Damien darted to Axel and Ivy, yanking them away from the confused henchmen. In the chaos, police officers secured the building, soon finding Lucas and Arya bound in a storage room. All 4 children were frightened, but unharmed. Rage contorted Langley's features as he tried to flee. Cruz tackled him to the ground, cuffing him. Confiscated ledgers tied him to kidnapping, blackmail, and other crimes. Broken and cornered, Langley spewed curses, but his reign ended that night in the flash of police lights. Trembling with relief, Damien scooped up his children in a protective embrace. They clung to him, tears mingling with sobs of "Dad." Elena raced in moments later, hugging them all. For the first time, they were truly united, a family broken by secrets and fear but now whole again. Over the next few days, the fallout shook the city's power structures. Langley faced multiple felony charges. Court evidence proved Elena's innocence. Damien had signed a portion of his holdings over, but given the criminal nature of Langley's demands, he retained partial control after litigation. Though diminished in corporate might, Damien felt no regret. Stepping before a sea of reporters, he made a brief statement. "I once believed love was a liability. Tonight, I realize it's the source of my greatest strength. If sacrificing my empire was the cost to save my children, I'd pay it 100 times over." The media devoured his every word. Where they'd once seen a ruthless mogul, they now saw a man risking everything for the family he never knew he wanted. An empire had been threatened, but a father's devotion had prevailed, sealing Langley's downfall. Months later, life settled into an entirely new rhythm. Langley languished behind bars, his influence shattered. Steel Enterprises, though bruised, survived under reorganized leadership. Damien retained a stake, but chose not to rebuild his iron grip on the boardroom. He had different priorities now. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, he and Elena shared a home, modest by his old standards, yet filled with warmth. The children relished a backyard to run in, free from fear. Each day was a learning curve, homework, bedtime stories, sibling tiffs. Fatherhood proved more challenging than any hostile takeover Damien had orchestrated, yet infinitely more rewarding. One lazy afternoon, the family picnicked in a small park. The kids tumbled in the grass, laughter echoing beneath the sun. Elena and Damien watched from a blanket, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut lawn. She turned to him, a soft smile on her face. "You've changed," she murmured, recalling the cold businessman she'd known long ago. He reached for her hand, eyes reflecting genuine contentment. "I never wanted a family," he admitted. "But now, I can't imagine life without all of you." Elena squeezed his hand, heart full. The children raced over, breathless with excitement, calling "Dad," "Mom," to show them a newly discovered frog by the pond. Damien stood, pulling Elena with him to follow. The world he once dominated felt distant now, replaced by simple joys he'd never dreamed possible. At last, Damien Steele understood that real power wasn't in crushing rivals or dominating markets. It lay in protecting the people you love, in cherishing the moments that knit a family together. He smiled as his children giggled by the water's edge, grateful for the second chance he'd been given. His empire may have cracked, but in that breach, light poured in, illuminating a future richer than any he'd ever dared to imagine. The end.